This episode was recorded live during the NFLC Virtual Summit in June. NFLC is the National Foreign Language Center at the University of Maryland. I'm joined by Ben Tinsley, a French teacher in Philadelphia. He had joined me back on episode 27 when we talked about diversifying the world language curriculum. In this episode, Ben talks with me about equitable feedback practices in the language classroom. This recording was viewed live by hundreds of participants, and the live recording now has over 2,500 views. The link to the live recording is in the show notes if you want to see a little bit of what it looks like behind the scenes. I want to thank Ben so much for his willingness to take this on with me. I'll check back with you after the conversation, but for now, let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom podcast today, which we are doing our first live stream podcast episode. And I'm joined today by Ben Tinsley. Hello there, Ben.
Hello, my good friend.
So I am doing this live stream event for the NFLC Virtual Summit, and the NFLC is the National Foreign Language Center at the University of Maryland, and the summit is being sponsored by or powered by, I believe is what they say, PEARL, which is Professionals in Education Advancing Research and Language Learning. So I've never done a live version of the podcast before, so this is really exciting, and having an opportunity for teachers to kind of see behind the scenes what we look like when we're doing this. But I just wanted to say that it is so wonderful to see teachers taking time out of their summer to attend this type of PD. I mean, it's one thing when you're in that mindset during the school year, but when you have the opportunity to, like, I call it your summer headspace, to fill some of your summer headspace with this means that we have some incredible educators out there. So how you doing, Ben?
I'm good. I'm tired and stressed, but excited and all those things all at once.
Hopefully it wraps together and makes it an okay experience for you in the end.
Thank you, friend.
Yeah. So we had our first conversation on the podcast, Ben and I, back in episode 27, where we talked about diversifying our curriculum in the world language classroom. So when I thought, who do I want to have as a guest on this podcast episode, I thought right away, one of the best conversations I had was with Ben, who he told me to call him Benzo, everybody. So I'm going to call him Benzo as well. He said I could call him Benzo. So
Offer still stands.
Awesome. So I immediately said, I want to continue that conversation, because when you have a good conversation, you want to keep going. And it just so happens that this topic today that we want to talk about, equitable feedback practices, is in line with the topics that have been happening throughout the virtual summit today. So with this idea of equitable feedback practices, there's so much wrapped up into it in terms of when we're talking about social justice standards and windows and mirrors and all that. And I'm going to let you do a ton of talking on this episode to let us in on all this. But I just want to make sure everyone knows who you are, Ben, so that they see, wow, this is a person who really, he's walking the walk with all of this. And so Ben, you may have seen him on social media. He's Afrofranco, and his website is afrofranco.com. And I was first introduced to his world through his videos, where he just videotapes himself in the classroom. And it's sort of, this is some really cool, effective teaching that's going on. And that's how I was first introduced to it. And so he's been doing this teaching thing for he just ended his 13th
Hey.
year, he told me earlier. And he is a teacher in Pennsylvania. And so he has a unique lens on being a French teacher, a lens that I personally don't have as a white person, and understand all the privilege that comes along with that. And as much as I attempt to diversify my curriculum, whether it's in a French classroom or a Spanish classroom, I need the guidance of
Mm,
teachers that are truly in the reality of living that every day as a window and a mirror experience. And so that's why I wanted to really continue this conversation with Ben. And
yeah.
one thing I want to say is that your quote on your website about who you are and what you do, um, his eyes get really big. He's like, I hope it's the right quote.
Yeah,
But
I'm nervous. I got a
so
lot happening.
no, it so definitely shows what you do as a teacher. And you say, in my classroom as a French teacher, I've committed to writing, building, delivering, and sharing curricula that exclusively centers Black faces and voices from the French speaking world.
Yeah.
I love how deliberate you are
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
And so can you just okay, now I've done a ton of talking now, and now this is going to be a
You're good at
platform for
that.
you. Okay, no, it's
And I'm really
happens.
good at smiling and nodding
Yeah,
too, so
well, I
we
get
can work that out
excited in these conversations.
for sure.
But with what I just said about who you are and what you do, can you bring us through that journey of how you got there and you
Yeah.
said, this is what I want to do as a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you framing it as a journey because it's been exactly that. Is that there's been a ton of unlearning that's had to happen. I think just through the work that I've done and through my own practice as a teacher, you realize how much you rely on what you've been taught, and that sometimes you have to take a step back to just imagine the world a little bit differently, to realize that teaching language can look a little different than you learned it as the language nerd kid that you definitely were, and as it was taught by the people that you consider to be experts at the time. So there's been half of my career, if not more than that, has just been like unlearning that. And then the other piece that you mentioned, which, I'll say proudly, is that I am deliberate about it. And it's taken a lot for me to get to a place where I'm as deliberate and as unapologetic about it.
Mhm.
And that hasn't come without a cost, right? So, like, the spaces in which I work, and just considering the national climate, the international climate, where to mention race is to be racist in the eyes of many
Mhm.
people. And so, for me to be in a place where I do center Black and Brown voices and places, particularly now in the spaces where I am, where the vast majority of my students do not identify as Black or Brown, has taken a lot of work. And it's taken for me to be this guy who looks the way I look with piercings and tattoos and locks and all that. I'm sort of always fighting this uphill battle of establishing that I have somewhat of an idea as to what I'm talking about. And so there's a lot of reasons for which I'm resentful about that. But I
Mhm.
also know that that's sharpened my sword so much. Is when I get into these spaces and I have to justify what I'm doing, and then ultimately, not to keep rambling, but seeing that the impact and the ripple effect beyond my classroom. That what my students are doing and what my students are being exposed to, and the sort of ends that I have in mind for them, that it feels really good for me as I'm teaching it, and I'm imagining what that would have been like for a 15-year-old version of myself, but also knowing that they're going to be out in the world making changes one way or the other. So that's really like a driving force in continuing that journey, because that journey's not done either,
Mhm.
which is a big part of
Yeah, I like that visual, the ripple effect. It's
it. Yeah,
sort of it starts there and ripples out.
for sure.
And so you talked a little bit about sort of how you've seen the benefits and success of this work,
Yeah.
but I'm just wondering, can you think of something like a really specific thing that's happened or something you've seen a student do that you think, wow, this work is definitely beneficial for students?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on a somewhat superficial level, but not really. is I use this example a lot of a student who reached out to me a few summers ago to tell me that they were in a cab in New York City and their cab driver happened to be from Algeria. And so they start speaking French for a half hour. They said they spoke French with this person. And not only did they speak French to the person, but they knew about cities in Algeria, right? They knew about indigenous peoples from Algeria. So the amount of times that I've been in that exact scenario where if you find out that where someone's from, or if you ask where they're from and they say Africa, and that you ask a little bit more, and
Hmm.
to just see how important it is for a person to be seen to that extent, to know that saying Africa is, I want to know more. I know more. I see your identity as being worthy of exploration, worthy of connection, so much so that this entire continent of 11.7 million square miles, I'm
Hmm.
not going to conflate it into one culture and one language and all that. So I've had a handful of experiences like that with students, all the way to students who go on to study the language in universities and colleges that other people
Hmm.
think are impressive. Um, and to go and do things. I have a student right now who just graduated. I'm not going to get too much into the details, but just graduated from undergrad, is taking a year off between undergrad and then med school, but they double majored in pre-med and French, and wants to eventually work in West Africa to, as a doctor.
Wow.
And yeah, and this is a Black woman as well. This is a
Hmm.
young Black woman. So for that student to have seen their own potential and to see that they can connect with the world that looks like them and that shares experiences, lived experiences that reflect their own, that's a biggie for me. That's a real
Yeah.
biggie for me.
Excellent. So, you ready to jump into this conversation that's specifically feedback and equitable feedback?
Let's get it, man.
All
I'm
right,
ready.
so let's do this. So, I would like to start with just some terminology, just to make sure we're
Yeah,
all using the same words to say the same thing. So, there's this idea of culturally responsive teaching, and
yeah,
I would. I don't necessarily know that it's Zaretta Hammond who kind of created that language or that she's just
sure.
the name I associate with it. But what does that mean to be culturally responsive with our teaching and in our classrooms for you?
Yeah, so for me, specifically in a language classroom, I mean, I feel like language lends so well to that. And it's just accepting that the content itself isn't always, if ever, the actual aim, right? That we're using the content to do something for people in the world. So culturally responsive teaching in the classroom, I mean, there's so many different applications, but just from a simple level of saying that um, the cultures and the people behind the language matter more than filling out than diagramming the sentences of the languages, and that's the objective, right? That we're doing it from that aim. Um, and then that the student matters. It's a real sort of operationalized way to have a student-centered classroom, to know that whether, regardless of how those students identify across the multiple identities that they have, right, that those are going to be filters and lenses through which they see the world, and that they're going to use the world to examine those lenses, right? That they're going to use the content and the things that we're doing in my classroom and beyond, hopefully, for them to step back and say, oh, I'm a person with a culture. I
Mhm.
have things that I've been conditioned to know and to believe that are not universal and that can be approached with through a critical lens. So to be culturally responsive in the classroom generally, I think, is to acknowledge the personhood of both the student, of the teacher, and the content, or the target cultures or target languages or whatever it is that you end
Mhm.
up teaching.
I that word personhood, acknowledge the personhood.
Um,
That's just like hearing a concept just by using that term. It really encapsulated that explanation. So thank you
right?
for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the just that mention of no student is going to be one dimensional, and there's this idea
Boom.
of the intersectionality that you referenced in there, that you're not just a female, you're not just a
Yeah.
male, you're connected in all these other experiences and identities, and
Yeah.
that's important to keep in mind as well.
Big time. Big time.
So a little more terminology to make sure again we're on the same page. Words that come up a lot: equity and equality.
Whew.
So, what is I hear I think I have a solid understanding of them, but I still hear them conflated. So, how do you see those
Yeah.
words?
Well, language is wild.
Mhm.
And when you say you hear them conflated, a current struggle I have is knowing that that conflation is strategic.
Mm.
Language gets co-opted by people who have like nefarious ends. So people now will hear equity and they'll be like, well, that's CRT, and
Mm.
CRT is evil, right? And they know that that's wrong. They just also know that if you can control a narrative, then you got control. That said, though, I see equity and equality as like equity is the means towards an objective of equality. And so the conflation of the two for me to suggest that equality means that we're going to start giving everyone the same thing is to deliberately ignore the goal of reaching an equal playing field or equal access to opportunities and all that. So, equity is for us to assess what needs to get done so that we can achieve equality. And so, what that looks like in the classroom as a teacher is to really examine critically what are the things that we're doing? What have we established as our goals? And how can we create an atmosphere? How can we create, digging from Zaretta Hammond's incredible work too? How can we create feedback that is instructive toward those objectives? So
Mhm.
that our students have equal access to those things. And importantly, too, not to hog the microphone right now, but importantly,
It's why you're here. This is
yeah.
why you're here.
Importantly is for them to see those systems that have created those inequities and begin to dismantle them, right? I think last time we spoke, I talked to you a bit about how I've struggled with a feeling of abandonment, that I spent half of my career working in under resourced and inner city schools, but like schools where the vast majority of the population are undereducated, under resourced, and all that sort of stuff. And now that I teach in these independent schools where there's resources for days, and while I still have abandoned those kids, and that's something I got to live with, I also got to know that these kids that I'm teaching now are ultimately going to be in positions of power. And so when they are in those positions, what can they do with what they did in my class beyond diagram sentences?
Mhm.
What is it that they're doing in my class that can make it so the next person doesn't have to change their name, doesn't have to anglicize their name or hide their accent or try to modify their accent, right? So that they can be taken seriously in a job interview, but so that their verbal tics don't have to change, right? I say, you know what I'm saying? Someone else says, you know. And
Mhm.
one of the two of those things, though they're both verbal tics, one of those is deemed as like improper English versus another one is just normal. So to use what we're doing in those classrooms, again, towards an equitable aim, sometimes means to burn everything to the ground
Mhm.
and to see
Mhm.
how we can sort of strategically burn it all to the ground.
Yeah. So, going a little bit more down this road with equity and equality, um, as I often say that I appreciate the opportunity to reach out to teachers who are just they have so much to offer, and so I'm going to
Mm.
use this opportunity to ask you my personal questions
Hit
about
me.
this, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I figure if I have it, at least one other teacher listening will have this question.
For sure.
So I'm with this idea of equality and equity. I am doing sort of my best efforts with it. At least I think I am,
Yeah.
and I try to have inclusive teaching,
Hmm.
inclusive of uh, different lived experiences in my classroom,
Sure.
and I sometimes think that by doing that, I'm also therefore being an anti-racist teacher at the same time.
Okay.
And I don't think I need to understand better, like what's like yes, we're going to be inclusive and focus on equity, but what's that extra step to actually
Mm.
be an anti-racist teacher classroom experience?
Ah, well, I'll start by
I
saying that
threw you
I
a
have,
hard ball. I'm really
yeah,
sorry.
dang, man. We're live too, bro. Give me a minute.
Yes, right?
Uh,
But I knew
well,
you can
I mean,
handle it. That's why I asked.
yeah, yeah, here we go. I mean, I think it's important to this keeps coming up for me that the idea of having to be an expert in things. I have no idea the answer to your question.
Mhm.
No, I shouldn't say I have no idea, but I don't have an answer to your question. And that sort of like intellectual humility is the same intellectual humility that I want teachers to have when they're in the classroom, afraid to talk about these different francophone cultures or whatever, afraid to talk about difficult conversations. And I put that in quotes and I'll dive into that another time. But afraid to have these difficult conversations because they don't feel like they have expertise in it. And the reality is that these are journeys that we can go along, that we can go into alongside our students. And there's so much value in saying to a 12-year-old, I don't know. I don't know everything that there is to know about Senegalese music, right? But I'm excited to learn about it with you. And we're going to go into it being careful of the following things. And we're going to critique one another if we mess up, but we're also going to see what is our aim, right? And so I think that approach to start out with the humility and to be able to not see yourself as a teacher who needs to be the expert who then like, you know, deposits knowledge into the student, into the empty vessel of the student.
Mhm.
If you can start from that place to say, I'm doing the work alongside you, then that's a big step. That said, though, inclusive teaching, I see them sort of parallel to the whole equality versus equity thing, or versus
Mhm.
and equity thing. In that inclusive teaching is a really important piece, right? In the toward the aim of anti-racist teaching. I see
Mhm.
anti-racist teaching more about dismantling systems,
Mhm.
and inclusive teaching is like a way toward that. That said, though, I struggle with the term inclusion. This is quoting the great Dr. Yaba Blay. If y'all don't follow her already, she's a former professor of mine at Temple University and one of the most brilliant people in the world. Sort of paraphrasing her, when you use the word inclusion, I still know whose house I'm in.
Mhm.
And so when I think about what I do in my classroom to center Black and Brown voices, we're not being included. You know, it's not a matter of adding to something else as an extension toward other things that we've deemed clearly as being more important because they're centered. We're going to center Black and Brown voices because I know that you're not necessarily going to get that somewhere else, and that I know that by centering the cultural practices and products and perspectives of Black and Brown people um, is to start to dismantle a system that has marginalized them. You know,
Mhm.
they are not marginal people; they are marginalized people. We are not, and so that's one step
Mhm.
among a billion that I'm still sort of working on. But to boil it down and to cut short this little soliloquy that I'm hitting you with, is to center these voices and to not wait until the month of February,
Mhm.
to not wait until Pride Month, to not wait until these sort of like add-ons, but to say we're going to do this every day. And we still manage to talk about likes and dislikes and communities and all those other
Mhm.
things. We just do it through the lens and and having centered Black people and Brown people.
Well, that was awesome. So thank
Yes.
you. Thank you for that. No, no, no. It's it's whenever you throw out like the challenge, the big challenges that we're all grappling with that don't have a yes or no answer. And I wasn't
Mm,
necessarily looking for a yes or no answer, but your perspective on it. And when you just took on the idea of intellectual humility,
yeah.
and like that just reminder right there, I'm like, oh, okay, that's I need to do that with my students. So it was an
Yeah.
opportunity to talk about that, so thank
Sure.
you very much
My
for all
pleasure.
of that.
Thank you. I hope I answered in any way. So-
You got me thinking about
okay.
things in a
Cool.
different way, which I wasn't doing before, and that's a
Mm,
much better place than I started with. So again, not about getting right or wrong answers.
cool. Thank you.
So let's let's turn our focus to look specifically at some feedback in the classroom. So we
Yeah.
have our understanding now somewhat. I mean, you're never going to totally understand, but equity and inclusion, and
Yeah.
so now when it comes to providing feedback to students, what are some common inequitable ways
Mm,
And I want to start there, so that we
yeah,
can kind of reflect on our own teaching. So, what are that you've seen or experienced? What are some common inequitable ways of grading and assessing or providing feedback that you've
yeah.
seen?
Well, I had this conversation recently with a good friend of mine, a colleague, and he just, after going back and forth for an hour and a half about all these ideas, he was like, really simply, just ask a teacher, what do your grades mean? And so the idea of a 100-point scale and just saying, like, well, you 87 and you 91 in itself, right, is like, what does that mean? To what extent am I measuring anything? Have I even established what I want to be measuring? To what extent am I measuring student like test anxiety versus their language proficiency or their intercultural proficiency? To what extent am I measuring whether or not a student has chores to do when they go home versus another kid who doesn't? So am I measuring anything, and am I measuring the things that I say that I'm measuring? And am I giving feedback that again is instructive? So is the feedback that I'm giving when I tell you that I say this to my students all the time. If I give you a test back and you got a 96 on it, you look at it and you're like, bet, and you keep it moving. Now, if I give you a test back and you got a 40 on it, then you crumple it up and put it in the trash. And in both of those scenarios, you didn't care at all about what you did and how you can improve. All you cared about was this like sort of transactional nature of like, did I jump through the appropriate hoops in
Hmm.
order to get that that what's the word, that money back from you, whatever, that
Right.
currency, thank you, that
Yeah.
currency. Um so having a 100-point scale, another thing that was a big change for me recently, and recently meaning like in the last 4 or 5 years, is looking at categories in the grade book. Like, why do we have homework as a category in the grade book? um, And maybe I'm wrong here, but starting to ask those questions, based on what have we decided to weight classwork and participation in a grade book? And have we made it clear? Do we proportionally instruct those things in our classroom? Like, are we clear in our instruction of work habits and all that in our classroom? So, just starting, one thing I did a while back, which has been helpful, was changing the categories in my grade book to being the modes.
Hmm.
And like, based on the evidence that you give me, this is the feedback of what your performance is in that. And one of the many good things that comes from that is that now I'm thinking that much more about, what work am I giving you? Is this a communicative task that I've given you? Is this an actual interpretive task that I've given you? I want to give you a grade on it.
Hmm.
So it's made me as a teacher that much more reflective about the work that I'm doing and making sure that it aligns with objectives. And it's made me establish objectives, right? If I don't have an objective and I'm just saying, open up to chapter one, page
Hmm.
one, exercise one, and let's just start moving forward,
Hmm.
which I did for a long time, right?
Right.
I did that because that's what worked for me, worked. That's what was done to me.
Hmm.
That's what was afflicted upon me.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so looking at the objectives and having feedback that is instructive toward those objectives,
Hmm.
um, is like huge steps in that direction.
Right. Yeah, I just
Yeah.
got back yesterday from San Diego. I live in Boston, and I was doing a workshop out in San Diego, and it was all about assessment in proficiency-based classrooms, and it's a real paradigm shift for teachers and moving out of the traditional categories. And there was so much of the conversation when I do any workshops on assessment. It's we always I put up on the board a compliance list,
Mm,
and when teachers are like, "So what are you assessing?" And then if it's really just grading them on their compliance, we just put it in there, and by the end of the day, we have this
everything.
huge list, and it's all these things that don't have anything to do with communication or the
Yeah,
modes or anything, and just
yeah,
compliance.
yeah. And what we see, the cultural lens through which we see compliance, right? That we're even, a lot of us haven't even taken the time to unpack, to be like, what do I think compliant behavior even looks like based on who I am, based on, you know, so to what extent do I see these students? There are a lot of students who come from cultural backgrounds that really value leaving space in the classroom or in any sort of social situation.
Mhm.
So for those kids, when I'm asking for participation to look a certain way, you speak this or you answer this many questions, like culturally, that's inequitable. There are kids who don't have that as a background. So have I even begun to unpack and to sort of critically analyze, like how much uh how unfair is this to students who come from a particular background? And how much
Mhm.
am I asking kids? And even if it's not a cultural background, I'm sorry, even if it's not a cultural background, but like to what extent am I putting on a pedestal extroversion? Not
Mhm.
everybody's an extrovert.
Mhm.
A lot of kids, a lot of our students are introverts. So those things that even just compliance can look different based on different, neurologies, different cultural backgrounds, and all that different identities.
Right. Yeah, it's the US school system. I think a lot of school systems, but my experience has been in the US school system that
Hmm.
it really comes down to is did you do the homework?
Oh,
What did you end up doing with it is another thing, but did
different
you do
story,
the
right?
homework? Are you prepared? Do you
Yeah,
have your materials?
yeah.
And there was even one teacher who actually she was a professor, she was a university professor, and she was asking really good questions about these are some ways of giving extra credit was what she was saying. So we had this whole
Mm,
discussion about extra credit and who does
yeah,
it and who doesn't. That's a whole nother story. But she
yeah.
said, when I have students, if they go to see a movie in the target language, they kind of get these extra points for that. And so I kept pushing it with, well, you have to pay for it.
Yeah. Who's that
So there's an
excluding?
equity piece. And
Boom.
then she said, "Oh, but on campus they're free." And I'm like, "Okay, so let's keep pushing. Maybe they have to work."
Maybe they have to work. Yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
like yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there's so many pieces of that, and a lot of what I struggle with, again, teaching in independent schools, is like, how seriously can we begin to have conversations about equity when it costs $40,000 a year to come here?
Mhm.
When these kids have SAT tutors that charge $400 an hour.
Mhm.
So if we can have these conversations, and I struggle with how serious we are about them when, you know, public schools even are determined, their funding's determined based on the taxes of the area, right?
Mhm.
How seriously how serious are we about dismantling these systems that create these inequalities in the first place,
Mhm.
um, when we're having conversations about equity and all that?
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming up from teachers,
Oh, I didn't
and
even peep.
no, it's good. I'm following them, and there's a lot of like, yes, yes, and they thought my asking you to talk about the anti-racist teaching was like a
Yeah.
little too much. We're live. It says we're live too, bro. But but you can handle it. We go way back.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. That's the homie.
just what going back to the introvert extrovert. This is Meredith White, who's out there right now listening,
Hey,
and
that's
she
the
said that
homie.
yeah, a lot of extroverts have learned how to fake it, knowing that they'll get the points and the credit.
Absolutely.
Even though that's not their
Absolutely.
natural demeanor. Hmm.
But there's a performative element to it for the teacher, which is a life skill too, right? Like that's a life skill, but that's not what I'm purportedly measuring in my class.
Hmm.
So all that stuff, work habits, time management, all those things, the argument isn't that they're not good things or that
Hmm.
students shouldn't learn those things. It's a matter of whether or not my grades reflect that and
Hmm.
whether or not my class time, my instruction time reflects me actually teaching you how to do those things.
Hmm.
So can I like measure that
Right.
equitably if I've
Hmm.
never taught it to you? I've never told you that that was explicitly what the goal was.
Yeah, there's that assumption that my culture and therefore my lens and my cultural expectation is yours, and I'm
Yep.
going to assess it based on that being the norm.
Yep.
That's dangerous area to get into.
Dangerous. And if I'm some like 60-year-old white woman who's wealthy and has never, so like,
Mhm.
and never thought to unpack those things,
Mhm.
and unpacking them doesn't mean self-flagellation. And I like using
Mhm.
that term, but that doesn't mean
Mhm.
just saying like I'm a bad racist person. It's just like what I know to be true isn't
Mhm.
universally true.
Mhm.
Let's get into some details about that. Raising your hand or asking to go to the bathroom or whatever, calling a teacher by their first name, like
Mhm.
whatever the things are that we assume to be universally true are not.
Mhm.
And to what extent have we forced students to assume our cultural lenses? And that sort of contortion that
Mhm.
Meredith is talking about, the kids who master it are denying their own cultural values,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Mhm.
Um, and that's not okay.
Right.
That's not where we want to land, and we can
Right.
begin to work towards something better.
Right. So there's one question that came up in the chat, just to go down a little bit more with the homework. Homework always becomes a big topic. It's
Yeah.
grammar and homework. That's like language teachers.
Boom.
We could do an entire series on grading homework.
I'm here
Um,
for that series too. If you want,
yeah.
we could do this.
Okay.
I
Well, you're
got you.
coming back this next season. You're going to be my first 3-time guest. You're my first
I'm
second
here.
time. You're going to be my first third
Oh,
time.
nice. Awesome.
So it's just more questions about homework categories
Yeah.
in the grade books.
Yeah.
And so specifically, rather than giving like advice on how to do it, I'm curious about how do
Yeah.
you assess or count, or do you even have homework in your classrooms?
I do. And homework that I give, I have kids do retells. And so homework are just an opportunity to recap what we did in class. And it's a presentational communicative task that they then, or I can look at as part of a body of work. I don't grade it for completion each time, but I can look at it as a part of a body of work within inter within presentational communication. I
Mhm.
might give them something else that's really short, but either way, it's not going to take you more than like 5 minutes to do, and it's going to reinforce the things that you did, and it's actually going to support a communicative mode.
Mhm.
So I have ideas about how I want to move forward next year that might make it a little bit more communicative in that, like,
Mhm.
maybe they compare and contrast something or whatever.
Mhm.
But either way, it's not getting graded for completion.
Mhm.
It's just an opportunity to add to your portfolio, essentially.
Right.
And it's taken a while for me to think of like what task can I give that would actually be helpful, as opposed to just saying like you should spend 30 minutes doing something.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And
Yeah.
so it's not a homework category. It's just another communicative task that you
Yeah.
can do at home.
Yeah. So it's in the modes category,
Boom.
but it's not necessarily done in the classroom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might be, right? Like they
Mhm.
might do it before the bell rings or
Right,
something.
right. So to round out this equity discussion, so again, this is a personal kind of dilemma of my own. So I'm going to ask
Mm.
you about it, assuming that other teachers are there as well.
I got you.
So we often believe, or I should say, I often believe that, or it's my intention at least, that I am providing feedback in equitable ways. Like it is my intention, it's forefront in my mind,
Yeah,
but I don't know that it always is. I would
sure.
love it to be perfect, then I'm always doing that. But what are some ways that we might be able to recognize that what we're doing is not necessarily equitable for students?
One of the things I learned in my early days of teaching in charter schools in Philadelphia, before I had any like background education in education, was the idea of involving students in making classroom rules, right? So you can have in mind, like, I want to make sure we touch on keeping hands, feet, and objects to yourself and whatever, like things like that.
Hmm.
But co-creating that with the students always got so much more buy-in, and I ended up learning a ton about things that I framed it in terms of like guidelines to help us thrive in this classroom, right? So they're not classroom rules, but I learned so much from genuinely get like guiding them towards the things that I want, that I had in mind already, but also genuinely like sort of mining them for input about what
Hmm.
would help them thrive in the classroom. And so similarly, like I have my rubrics. This is the thing I did just now towards the end of the school year, is I had my students like we co-created the rubric descriptors. So I typically have like limited, approaching the standard, meets the standard, and exceeds.
Hmm.
And they came up with L for limited, mid for approaching, valid for meets, and goaded for exceed. And just something that simple to involve them in coming up with the language. I swear, in that moment, no exaggeration whatsoever, the kids were so much more comfortable self-evaluating.
Mhm.
They were like, "Nah, that was a mid performance. Like, I could have been doing this. I missed
Mhm.
this, whatever." And it's like they weren't thinking, "Oh, mid means 70 or whatever."
Mhm.
They weren't thinking like, "I need." They were
Mhm.
genuinely invested in what that means. So all that to say, involving the student, involving the people to be culturally responsive, to center their personhood too as the drivers of their own learning, um, is to involve them in like goal setting and progress monitoring and all that, and to do it in terms that make sense to them. That's sort
Mhm.
of like, you know, Gen Z language,
Right.
just borrowed from Black people, of course. But yeah, it's language that makes sense to them.
Mhm.
And so yeah, that piece.
Yeah, that question that you said you asked the students, what will help you to thrive?
Yeah.
And that co-creation space, that came up in a discussion I had on motivation with Tracy Rucker
Oh wow,
back
yeah.
early on in the podcast, and really having that motivation in the classroom came from those co-created spaces.
Yeah. Yeah,
So it was reminiscent of that as you were talking about it. So shout out
for
to
sure.
Tracy Rucker as well.
Yeah, shout out
Uh,
Tracy Rocker.
so you are an incredible inspiration to so many people. And I know I
Thank
asked
you.
you, yes, and I know I asked you this the last time. I ask all of my guests where your inspiration comes from or
Mm,
where you're continuing to do your work
yeah,
to be better at what you do. And what does that look like for you when you're striving?
yeah,
I know that you are a voracious reader.
yeah.
I know I see that all the time in your Facebook group. But like,
Yeah.
what does that process for you look like when you're trying to be better at this?
Yeah, it's funny. One, reading, right?
Mhm.
And thank you for the kindness and all that. Touching on what you said earlier on in this little episode here, it's just like, I'm so grateful for teachers who are out here attending these workshops and reading these books. Because again, it speaks to the fact that like we're not assuming that we're done because there's an MED at the end of my name,
Mhm.
right? And that there's so much more work to do. Knowing that even if you did all that work back in 2015, that a 15-year-old in 2022 is drastically different than a 15-year-old was in 2015. So we
Mhm.
got work to do to figure out what culturally responsiveness looks like in this new culture. So, I think about, this is a random connection, but I've been listening to a lot of these like basketball podcasts, and I just got around to watching The Last Dance, which is like the docu-series about Michael Jordan. You think about these amazing players, like all these people who had so much talent to get to the NBA, but then there's these people like Kobe Bryant who just was always in the gym and was never okay with the fact that they made it to the league. And, you know, that idea that we're spending our summertime reading and we're attending workshops and we're collaborating with people and stealing ideas from Meredith White, right?
Mhm.
And being okay with that, knowing that like this thing that's going to work in my classroom was not of my own creation, but
Mhm.
Meredith White created this and I'm stealing her work.
Mhm.
Um, that so again, it comes back to intellectual curiosity and humility
Mhm.
to know that like we're still working, and a love of learning.
Mhm.
I'll close this
Yeah.
little monologue with
Yeah.
that. Is that if I want my students, I know that there's only so much that I can do in my classroom. Even if language proficiency is the bottom line for my students, if that's the end game, there's only so far that I can actually take them. But my goal is to get them to like escape velocity, to get them
Mhm.
out into the world where they're going to take, like this student of mine who's going on to study in college and then going to spend a year in France and do all this stuff.
Mhm.
Like that's where they're really going to do all these amazing things. So I want to inspire that love of learning that's going to make them continue doing this far beyond them doing it
Mhm.
in my classroom. And that starts by modeling it, by being
Mhm.
that teacher right now that says Joshua Cabral has so much to teach me still, and to be, and I mean this sincerely, to
Mhm.
be in connection with you and to be someone that I consider to be a friend to you
Mhm.
has made me such a better teacher. And I'm so, excuse me, I'm so grateful for that. So do that. Be friends with dope
Right.
people like Joshua.
Yeah. Not to keep patting each other on the back here, but I remember you tweeted out a couple of months ago just this one random tweet, and you said, Dr. Tinsley. What does that sound like? And I just wanted to put in my vote that I think it sounds awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
I think
I'm
that's definitely a direction to go in.
yeah.
Remember that tweet? I always
I know.
remember
I
that.
remember vividly that
And
tweet,
I
and I
think
know.
most people said that. Like, go
Yeah,
down this
yeah,
road.
yeah.
Go down this
It's
road.
still on the table. I got to get another baby out of diapers before I start giving myself more homework to do. But
More homework to do.
yeah,
All right.
yeah,
So I am by reading all of these comments and know everyone's listening to this, and I'm going to repurpose this episode in the fall to put it out on the podcast as well. There are going to be teachers that definitely want to reach out to you.
yeah.
So what is the best way to reach out to Ben and continue these conversations?
Please, please, please stay in touch. There's nothing I love more than being in touch with curious teachers and all that. You can find me at on social media like Twitter and Instagram. I'm AfroFranco2. And then my website is afrofranco.com. And I have a book club, so that's on the website and on Facebook if you check out Afro Franco. But any of those ways, please be in touch and share with me some of the ideas that y'all have.
Excellent. So before we wrap up and say goodbye, I like to always leave teachers with a really actionable, hearty piece of advice because there's so
Yeah,
much that we learn throughout, this 45-minute discussion. But what's a good takeaway for teachers as they look at equitable feedback in their classrooms?
yeah. Well, Grading for Equity is a really, really important book to
Hmm.
read and to take your time with. And culturally responsive teaching in the brain, the Great Zaretta Hammond is a
Hmm.
phenomenal book to read. And more broadly, is to read and keep growing and follow Joshua and listen to the podcast and follow, Dr. Liam Printer and follow Meredith White and follow me if you like to. And yeah, and all those great things.
Just keep in collaboration. Well,
For sure.
I thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and sharing your experience, particularly on this first live episode. So, thank you so much for being here today, Ben.
Thank you. It's been nothing short of a pleasure as always. Thank you, Ben.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Ben Tinsley? I'm sure that you're walking away with more clarity and motivation when it comes to providing feedback to your students that is personalized and recognizes them. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Ben and perhaps watch the live recording. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.